Ted looked at the number written on the paper, and his eyes grew large. This was way more money than he had made in a year, and this guy was offering it to him for... So, what do you want to pay me for, exactly? The man in the black suit stared at him hollowly from behind his mirrored sunglasses. He sat nonchalantly across the table in the small coffee shop that Ted had written in for the last 4 years. Ted liked the ambience here, and many of the local writers seemed to think it was a great place to read as well. Ted could see many others around him, plinking away on their MacBooks or off-the-shelf Walmart laptops as they wrote the next great American novel or the next hit screenplay. The longer the man sat there, the more Ted wished he had approached one of them instead. "It's very straightforward," the man said, his voice in cadence reminding Ted of Agent Smith in the Matrix movies. "We want to pay you for your talent. You come to our office, let us see your talent, and we pay you for it. Sounds like something you might be interested in?" Then he smiled, his lips sliding away from his perfectly artificial teeth, and Ted cringed all over. It was like a dog who'd been taught to smile, unsettling and a little alarming. But it was a lot of money. "Let me think about it," Ted hedged, and the smile slid mechanically from the man's face. He produced a business card, rising suddenly and holding it out. "Let us know if you change your mind. The offer's valid whenever you're ready." He left then, making his way for the door like a shark hunting for its next meal. Ted looked at the card and wrinkled his eyebrows. It was a plain white business card, nothing fancy, with the words "Libris Talent," because your talent should never go to waste. Ted looked at it for a while as his laptop screen went into sleep mode, darkening and allowing him to see himself as he sat in contemplation. How very curious. Ted had been writing in some form or another for his whole life. When he was a kid, he drew pictures and created games for his friends to play. Ted's pictures, his mother swore, always told a story, and his games were never the haphazard mess that his friends often concocted. People who weren't even part of Ted's friend circle often came to join their games, and they were both fun and engaging in a way that was hard for a child to explain. His teachers praised his creativity and expected that he would do great things one day. As Ted grew, so grew his stories. By the time he was in middle school, Ted's work with fantasy was often entered into writing contests and local student work projects. His playground games had evolved into role-playing games, and when Ted was 12, he discovered the fantasy world of Dungeons & Dragons. He began a lifelong love affair with the game, and he took to the role of game master quickly. Ted's campaigns were immersive, his characters engaging, and his adventures never fell victim to the problems his friends usually encountered. Ted wrote well, and again, the adults in his life often praised him, expecting great things from him in the future. It had been a no-brainer for Ted to start studying writing after high school. He had soared through what is normally a very trying time for teens by channeling his churning emotions into his medium. Ted had gotten more than one scholarship for writing, and as college loomed, he put all of his efforts into his work. Ted spent the next 4 years working on a BA in English and Literature, and in the end, he felt he had the expected tools to begin plying his craft professionally. Now, however, Ted was trying to figure out how to turn his talent into a paycheck so he could pay his bills. Magazines liked his work, but wanted a writer with more experience. There were people online who would pay for his stories, but not enough to live off. Agents were interested, but they didn't want to take a chance on someone so young. Ted's writing was always well received, but there was always the ever-present "but" hanging at the end of all those praises. A few interested publishers had approached him, but it was always the sort that buried the line of price amidst all the talk. Ted was 26, 4 years out of college, self-published, untried, and no one was willing to take a chance on him. No one except Libris Talent, that was. Ted Googled them, of course. He had been burned too many times before and wanted to see what he was in store for if he decided to take their offer. Their website was professional, but ultimately soulless. Their credentials were numerous, but were presented without any real pride. This soulless corporation wanted another book for their accolades, another pet writer for their trophy case. If Ted signed on with them, he would be just another soulless shill who writes for nothing but a paycheck. Ted's phone buzzed. He looked down and sighed as he saw a message from the power company. His check had bounced again, and they were going to shut his power off at the end of the month if he didn't come up with some kind of money. That likely meant that Mr. Capish, his boss at the gas station, had given them bad checks again. He would never admit it, and this likely meant that Ted wouldn't get paid until the end of the month. He looked at the card. Or maybe he'd be able to keep the lights on after all. Ted nervously checked his phone to make sure he had the right address. He had come to a 2-story stucco building that looked more like a distribution center than a publishing house. Ted had worn his best interview clothes, a polo and a pair of slacks, and he already felt underdressed and unsure of the situation. The outer facade bore a simple sign, white and stark, just like the business card. Libris Talent. Ted thought about leaving, but the call of the money was too much to resist. The woman behind the counter wore a similar smile as he walked in. She was looking at the door as though expecting him, and her pantsuit and coiffed hair made her look assembled rather than styled. Ted was taken aback by her smiling regard, and he almost left again. The waiting area was as stark as the outer facade, and the receptionist's regard made him feel like he had been marked. Had she been staring at that door the whole time, just waiting for someone to come in? "Hi," Ted said. I'm looking for—" "Welcome, Mr. Dreff. Mr. Sereph is waiting for you in the back. Please go right ahead." She pointed to a door to the left of the waiting room, and Todd walked hesitantly toward it, his strange feeling growing with every step. Behind the door was a long hallway of offices, names neatly stenciled on the doors. Mr. Sereph's door was the third in line. Ted knocked, and a voice from the other side invited him in. Mr. Sereph sat behind his desk, the too wide smile stretching his lips painfully. "Mr. Dreff, I'm so glad you decided to accept my generous offer." Ted sat across from the grinning man, feeling like Faust as he met with the devil. "Well, it was too good an offer to pass up, I guess," Ted said. "Why, yes. The money is a fine incentive, isn't it?" Ted shuffled in his seat, not liking the man's regard. "So, how does this work exactly? Do I have to write something for you, or—" Ted blinked as a contract appeared on the desk. Mr. Sereph was leaning over the desk, too, that smiling face of his, a little too close for Ted's liking, and he handed him a heavy silver pen. Had that contract been there the whole time? Ted sat back a little, that too wide smile putting him off as the man leered at him. "What's wrong? I thought you were ready to sign." "I am. I'm just curious about what's involved in this," Ted asked. "Show us your talent, and we pay you for it. Couldn't be simpler." Ted looked at the contract, unsure of whether to sign or not. He'd heard of writers getting sucked into these unfair contracts before. He didn't fancy being someone's pet writer, his talent milked for God knew how long. Ted looked down at the contract, but it wasn't particularly helpful either. They offered to pay him for his talent, but that was all it said, really. It was very vague, not really saying anything other than that, with a lot of industry speak in between. As Ted hesitated, though, the money loomed up in his mind again. That was a lot of money, enough to live comfortably for quite a while if he was careful. No matter what they had him do, that kind of money could change his life. And even if it were repetitious or degrading, he'd still be doing what he loved, right? Ted signed the contract and pushed it back to the smiling man. Mr. Sereph made it disappear before the ink was even dry, and Ted was left holding the bulky silver pen in his numb fingers. "Excellent. Now come with me so we can assess your talent." Mr. Sereph rose from the desk and led him out of the office. Ted followed wordlessly, still not quite sure what to expect. The long corridor slid past as they walked, and the sameness was a little disorienting. Mr. Sereph stopped outside of another nondescript door and held it open. Inside was a stark white room, cluttered only by a desk and a pin in one of those ornate pin holders you often saw at weddings. Mr. Sereph nodded to the desk, indicating that Ted should sit. "What do you want me to do?" Ted asked, still hovering in the doorway. Ted wasn't sure he wanted to enter that unblemished space. "Just take up the pen. It'll know what to do from there," Mr. Sereph said, still grinning that troubling smile. Ted hesitated a moment longer before walking inside, the door slamming like a coffin lid behind him. Ted took a seat. On the desk was a single piece of paper, unblemished, and as he looked at it, he could swear that the surface moved. He didn't want to touch it, but it seemed to beckon him to nonetheless. He reached out for the pen, that instrument of creation, and it felt very right in his hand as he lifted it from the holder. He set the tip against the paper, and again, he thought it moved. What was he meant to do here? What was he meant to write? Show them his talent? How was he meant to... The pen came down on the paper, its tip blotting the surface as though through magnetism. Suddenly, Ted was writing. He was writing words, crafting stories, spilling ideas as the paper drank them down before his eyes. He spilled days, weeks, years' worth of stories onto the paper as he wrote. His hand cramped, his wrist ached, but still the merciless pen took his words. The paper drank greedily, swelling as he worked. Ted's vision swam as he felt his words dragged out of him, sucked from his body, and he felt certain that he must die. The paper swelled as he wrote, becoming sheets, a novel, a towering juggernaut of pages. The room began to fill with pages, pressing against the ceiling and bulging against the walls. Ted was powerless to stop his hands from writing, but soon the pages began to block out the light, and he wrote in a state of darkness. The pages pressed at him from all sides, entombing him in written word, and yet he wrote. When he finally passed out, it was a blessing. Ted woke up in his bed, his arm throbbing, his fingers and hands feeling like rubber. But when he tried to move, he found that they were asleep. He shook at them, thinking that maybe it had just been a weird dream. He had written himself into a literal tomb, and as he looked at his arm, he almost thought he could see blisters on his fingers. He sat down at his computer, looking through his emails for job offers, when he came across a new email from Libris Talent. He thought it strange, considering that he had just been dreaming about them, and now they were sending him a message. He figured they wanted to make him another offer for his talent, whatever the hell that meant. He opened it and read through the email, confused as he read the contents. Dear Mr. Dreff, we would like to thank you for your talent. Please find enclosed the payment for your talent. We hope you are satisfied with the transaction. Regards, Mr. D. Sereph. Ted read the email repeatedly before opening the app on his phone linked to his bank account. Ted's eyes went wide when he saw the amount in the account. He goggled at it in disbelief. It hadn't been a dream after all. He had sold his talent, he guessed. Ted grinned as he thought of the possibilities. Mr. Sereph had been right. This amount of money could indeed be life-changing. Ted sighed as he stepped back through the door to his apartment. He'd been on a 2-week vacation in the Bahamas, spent those 2 weeks in the lap of luxury, too, and still hadn't made a dent in the amount of money Mr. Sereph had put in his bank account. It was a sobering feeling, being able to do whatever you wanted, living life that few ever dreamed of. Now he was back, though, and he supposed it was time to get back to work. The money was nice, but it wouldn't last forever. The news feed on his computer pinged to let him know that one of his favorite authors had just released a new book. Ted opened the link and looked at the book, but he felt a strange surge of confusion as he read over the synopsis. It was a new novel, not like anything the guy had ever wrote before. A world of high fantasy, a tale of adventure set in the world of Eridar, where the lords of the hunt sought the prince of... Ted was astonished. That was his story. He'd been fleshing out the concept for years, and his manuscript was almost ready for submission. He had been so close to sending it off. Well, maybe in a couple of years he would have. He had just been getting it ready before he sent it off. He wanted to make sure it was perfect. The manuscript. Ted had the manuscript saved on his Google Doc. Ted furiously opened the browser, putting in his information as he brought up the account. It would be time-stamped, dated. He could take it to the proper people and prove that his work had been stolen. He couldn't believe that something like this had happened to him. He had read about this sort of thing happening online, but he never dreamed that it would happen to him. It was unthinkable, impossible. His Google Doc was empty. The screen was devoid of content. He pulled open the drawer next to his desk, searching desperately for a thumb drive he kept there as a backup. The drawer was also empty. Ted searched the computer for traces of his manuscript, his stories, anything at all, but they had all been erased. Ted had begun to panic then. What had happened? Someone had been in his apartment. Someone had stolen his work. Someone had taken his talent. Ted combed through his emails, searching for the email from Mr. Sereph. It, too, was gone. Nowhere to be found. It was as though he had never actually spoken to anyone. He found Mr. Sereph after 3 weeks of stalking the coffee shop. He had gone down to the building that had been Libra's Talent, but it was abandoned. The doors were locked, the sign was removed, and the building looked empty and forlorn. It had been too big of an operation to simply close up overnight. He had asked the people in the building about it, but all of them had just shook their heads, saying they didn't know anything about a talent agency or a publishing house. That was when he had taken to stalking the coffee shop. The place was always packed, and if Mr. Sereph was looking for other writers to swindle, he might come back there. He'd brought his laptop the first few times, but had finally just stopped. He was too distracted to write these days, after finding out his life had been stolen, and all he thought about was having his work returned to him. He'd spent the last 3 weeks drinking coffee and keeping his eyes peeled. He arrived when the place opened, and he didn't leave until the final customer had shuffled out. It was just after sunset on Tuesday when he found him. "What we're looking for is your talent." Ted swung his head around sharply. The man at the adjoining table was talking to a blonde girl that Ted had seen hanging around lately. She was working on a screenplay, he thought. Working hard, it seemed, and it seemed that she had gained the interest of Libra's Talent. She looked over at the business card and told him she'd think about it before leaving in a hurry. The man sat for a moment, watching her leave, before turning to look at Ted. "Mr. Dreft, I hear you've been looking for me." Ted jumped, not sure what he would say, as Mr. Sereph came sauntering over to his table. He sat in the empty seat, his too wide smile making Ted cringe as it always did. He took a sip of the cold coffee that Ted had left there and seemed to be waiting for him to speak. Ted still wasn't sure how to begin this encounter. In his head, Ted had always been indignant, downright angry, but now as he stared into that too wide smile, he felt unsure of what he was doing. "I assume that you're here to talk about your talent. I must say, when it hit the bestseller list, I was shocked. I suppose we could reassess your price if you're looking for more money." That lit the fire in Ted again. "I want to know exactly what the hell you think you're doing. You break into my apartment, you steal my work, clean out my hard drive, and then you think you can just bribe me with more—" "I did no such thing," Mr. Sereph said, rolling his eyes. "We paid you for your talent. Your talent was writing. You signed a contract and were compensated handsomely." "Wait, you mean you paid for my stories?" Mr. Sereph scoffed. "Stories? Mr. Dreft, have you tried to write since you woke up in your bed?" Ted thought about it. Had he written anything in the past 2 weeks? Had he even felt compelled to write anything? He had signed his name to a few things, maybe written a text or two, but other than that, he hadn't written so much as a sentence creatively. He'd been having so much fun that the need hadn't arisen, and that should have worried him. The writing was what Ted did. Without it, his life was empty. That's right. You sold your talent rather cheaply, too, Mr. Dreft. But your kind usually does. You cut your goose open too quickly and find nothing as valuable as what you had. So, what is Libra's Talent, then? You sell ideas to other writers? Mr. Sereph scoffed again. Ideas? You're still thinking too small. Do you think that talent is something that just lasts forever? Talent is a finite resource, Mr. Dreft. It flows and ebbs. Some people are lucky enough to have a large tidal pool, but some people have to buy their talent to supplement. Libra's Talent finds those in need of talent, literary, athletic, political, what have you, and we get talent for them. Ted's blood ran cold. So, I'll never write again? Mr. Sereph looked a little sad. Sorry, kiddo. Looks like you're just gonna have to live your life like one of these other talentless schlubs. But hey, if you ever decide you want to buy some talent, do keep us in touch. He left a business card on the table and made his way out. Ted sat there, hearing the click of the keyboard and the creation of raw ideas as they went on around him, and put his head in his hands. Titus hovered over his laptop as he tried to find the words. He'd been at a standstill for weeks, and he needed to get it finished so he could... What exactly? So he could send it in and receive his latest rejection letter? He'd been writing for years. After he'd been laid off thanks to the pandemic, He'd written twice as much as he usually did. All it ever seemed to net him, though, was rejection. His wife was being patient about it, but as the bills racked up and the money coming in barely fed their family, he could tell that his joblessness was getting to her. Everything would be better if he could just get his hands on some money. If he could just finish this book, he knew it would get his life back on track. The idea had been brewing for years, but it was finally coming together. Forests of Ellenmore would be an earmark in great fantasy stories. There was action, intrigue, forbidden love, warring nations, and a believable magic system. It was so different from the Drek currently on the market. He knew it would be a bestseller, if only he could finish it. The computer chimed, drawing his attention from his passion project. Titus sighed as he glanced at the new email. Probably another late notice, or a message about his account being overdrawn. The sender was unfamiliar, though. A company named Libris Talent had a special offer just for him. Titus started to delete it, but something stopped him. Something nagged at him to open it. Maybe it was a life-changing offer he'd been waiting for. After some internal struggle, he decided to open it, wanting to see what sort of ridiculous offer they had made for him. He thought it was probably a sales pitch for a magazine subscription, knowing his luck, and prepared to be underwhelmed. As Titus read, though, he felt his eyebrows go up. This was a little more than a magazine subscription. Dear Mr. Harrow, we at Libris Talent have been following your recent hardships with great interest. We understand that times are hard just now, and we'd like to reach out a helping hand to struggling writers like yourself. We want to extend the chance to sell your talent to Libris Talent. We pay top dollar for talented individuals, and we would love to add your talent to our company's ever-growing pool. We look forward to your visit. See you soon, Mr. P. Sereph. There was a phone number at the bottom of the email, along with an address for Libris Talent. Titus looked at it for a moment, rereading the email, before closing it and starting his story again. Just as he'd thought, it was some sort of scam company trying to take advantage of people in the current climate. Titus started writing again, erasing more than he kept, but he found himself coming back to that email again and again. What sort of talent were they looking for? Were they offering work? Were they looking to represent him, maybe? The more he thought about it, the more intrigued he became. He could use the money, and if he didn't like what they had to say, he could always refuse. Titus reopened the email, and after Googling the address, he closed his laptop. The sooner he talked to them, the sooner he could get back to work. The address had not led him to a rundown strip mall, as he suspected it would, but to an elegant office building. It was clean, well-maintained, with a large sign over the door declaring it to be Libris Talent. This place looked more like a law firm than a fly-by-night operation, and Titus rechecked the address to make sure he had entered it correctly. Once he was sure that he had the right place, Titus stepped inside and was welcomed by a deep chime overhead. He was suddenly overcome with a strange sense of vertigo as he entered the lobby and grabbed the doorframe to steady himself. The starkness of the room shocked him at first glance, and the walls had a strange sort of depth to them that seemed bottomless. It hurt his head to look at them for too long, so he turned his focus on the rest of the room. There were no chairs, though, no love seats to mar the illusion, only a reception desk with a smiling woman manning it. Her smile was a trifle unsettling. Titus became worried that it might extend all the way back and slice the top of her head off just above the ears. Greetings, Mr. Harrow. Go right ahead. Mr. Sereph's been expecting you, she said, pointing to a door behind the desk. Titus was suddenly hesitant. How did you know who I was? We've been expecting you, she said, still flashing that brilliantly unsettling grin. Go ahead, sir. It's no good keeping Mr. Sereph waiting. Titus wanted to question her further about the mysterious Mr. Sereph, but felt it might be safer to just do as she said. She had turned that smile away from him, returning to her work, and he was left with no option but to proceed or leave. He walked into the hallway lined with identical white doors that bore little name plaques. The hallway seemed to go on much farther than the outside of the building would have led him to believe, and Titus wondered if it were some sort of illusion. As he walked, he thought he could hear strange sounds coming from behind some of the doors, but it made him feel uncomfortable to linger outside for too long. He walked until he found Mr. Sereph's door and knocked. He was invited into an office as stark as the lobby. Mr. Sereph, it seemed, was a minimalist, and his office contained a desk, 2 chairs, and a black book with a handsome silver pen sitting inside of a holder. It had none of the photos or clutter common to a working man's desk, and Titus found this as odd as the office itself. Mr. Sereph was a well-kept man who looked about 30, his blonde hair curtaining his face in a European style, as meticulous as his white suit. When he smiled, Titus suddenly felt the urge to run. His too wide grin reminded Titus of the Cheshire Cat, his too big eyes reminding him of the big bad wolf. Titus was suddenly very afraid of being gobbled up, bones and all. If Mr. Sereph noticed his discomfort, it didn't seem to bother him. "Ah, Mr. Harrow, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Titus sat without really meaning to. The man's voice compelled him with its dulcet tones, and it made him forget about his unease for the millisecond it took him to plant his rump. This also put him at eye level with the strange book, and Titus felt his eyes drawn to it as it hunkered on the desk. Titus almost imagined he could see it breathing, watching him, liking him so close, so it might suddenly leap out and, "I trust you found the office easily. It wasn't likely to be what you expected, I'd wager." How did you know that I'd come?" Titus stammered, dragging his eyes off the strange book. "Oh, we've been assessing your talent for quite some time. We feel it could use a more ambitious hand, someone likely to make better use of it. We would like to utilize your talent, as we do with many unambitious individuals. You will be compensated, of course. Times are hard, and a man with no job has to feed his family somehow. What do you say? Do we have a deal?" he purred, putting the bait out like a talented angler. Titus, however, was wary. This smiling man seemed to know all about him, but Titus knew nothing about who he was or what he expected. Who the hell was this guy? He was certain he'd never seen anyone like this before, but somehow he knew all about Titus. How long had he been watching him? Why was he so interested in his talent, as he called it? "How is it that you know so much about me, but I've never seen you before in my life?" "Oh, we know a lot about you, Mr. Harrow. We know you've been out of work for almost a year. We know your wife has become the sole breadwinner for the household and is barely getting by. We know you're in a great amount of debt. We also know that the debt is likely to get deeper without a miracle or untimely access to your life insurance." Titus started to become indignant, but Mr. Sereph put up a hand. "But that is behind you now. With the money we intend to pay you for your considerable talent, you can live the life of a free man once again. Take back what was stolen from you. Clean the slate. A fresh start. What do you say?" Suddenly there was a check in Mr. Sereph's left hand and a pen in his right. Titus could see $20,000 scrawled on the value line and felt his anger disappearing. With that kind of money, he could settle his debts. He could survive until this pandemic was over if he was careful. He could get out from under the funk he'd been squashed beneath for so long. The black book was open between them. When had that happened? It seemed to be waiting, greedily longing for his signature. For his talent. Titus took up the pen shakily, a sweaty hand taking the check and stuffing it into his pocket. He signed his name on the rough top sheet of the book. As his name lay across the pages, he tried to pull his hand back, but it was outside his control now. It moved furiously, the words spilling from the pen across the page. Pages became sentences, paragraphs, chapters, and finally, whole novels, as Titus only watched in horror. The pages riffled, turning, accepting his ink, accepting his talent, and Titus screamed and begged for it to stop. His hand, however, gave away all he had and more. The pages swallowed it all, swelling to a monstrous size as he wrote. Titus didn't know how much he had in him, and soon the ink began to trickle from the page like an oozing wound. It pooled around him, rising like a tide, and he saw Mr. Sereph's smile disappear beneath the liquid tar before his vision was covered in murk. Even as he descended into blackness, he wrote. He awoke on the couch, breathing heavily, the evening news just finishing up. In entertainment news, it looks like fans of Mark Daniels will have something to celebrate soon. He tweeted today that he's began a new novel, Tribes of Ellenmore. Fans of his talented writing, such as myself, can't wait. Titus shuddered. That was his book. His story. Not anymore, though, it seemed. It was gone now. And as he sat on the couch, he tried to remember. He couldn't even think of what it had been about, though. It had been a fantasy story set in somewhere. There had been elves. It was gone, though. It was all gone. Titus remembered the pages upon pages in the black book and wondered if it was the only thing that was gone. He felt something in his pocket, and reached in to find the crumpled check, paid to Titus Harrow $20,000. On the memo line, it said, "For your talent." Titus now suspected that this transaction had been more Faustian than he had believed. As the check said, Mr. Sereph had purchased more than a book. He had purchased his talent. He felt tears slide down his face as he came to realize what he had sold. In the end, it might have been less painful to sell his soul than his talent. Mr. Claude T. Griggs smiled as he saw the frantic man coming shakily towards him from across the bar. He had expected this. He had sold him exactly what he'd asked for, but not necessarily what he'd wanted. It served him right, though, Claudius thought, as he took another sip from his drink. The man, this Mr. Sereph, had clearly been tricking people for a long time. It was time he had a taste. Mr. Sereph slammed his hands down on the table, and the heads that turned quickly looked away again. This was none of their concern, and they didn't want to get involved with this wild and unstable fellow. "What did you do?" he whispered harshly. "What in the hell did you do?" "Sold you my talent. It was what you wanted, wasn't it?" Claudius asked, taking another leisurely sip from his glass. He tried to keep the smile from his face as he said it, but he failed miserably. It was just too funny, after all. Libris Talent had contacted him in the usual way. They had seen some of his work online, a burgeoning crime novel about a serial killer and his murder spree, and though it was coming along nicely, it was really more of a hobby. Claudius had things he was passionate about, a career he was striving to advance in, and writing was just a hobby at the end of the day. He wanted to eventually finish it, but it seemed that Libris Talent and the ever-smiling Mr. Sereph didn't want to wait anymore. The email had offered him compensation for his talent. The sum was fair, and Claudius was tempted to take this Mr. Sereph up on his generous offer. Claudius was no fool, though. He knew enough to do research, and the research was what made him curious about this Mr. Sereph and his Libris Talent. A quick Google search showed him many positive reviews for the company, many squibs about philanthropy and charity, but very little about what the company actually did. Sure, they were generous, but what did they produce with that talent? Claudius saw no books, no magazines, nothing but a simple website that proclaimed them as a talent agency, always with the word in capital. Talent. At the end of the day, that seemed to be what they peddled, and business seemed pretty good. Good enough to travel from town to town and find people willing to sell their talent, only to disappear in the night again once the business was done. He learned this little fact on a small subreddit, and that was also where he had met a stranger who had information that turned out to be very important. He called himself Fallen_Libris, and he had a good many things to say about Libris Talent and Mr. Sereph. He claimed that the man had bought his talent, and when he had lost the ability to write. It had taken him months to be able to write more than a simple email. His story, his ideas, his talent, they had all been sold to someone else. That someone had used them to expand his small fortune and left Fallen_Libris with a small check and a sense of emptiness that no money could take away. That had given Claudius an idea he had set into motion with his return email. He had arrived at Libris Talent to be greeted by a stark waiting room and a smiling woman whose eyes were just a little too bright as she told him to go ahead to the back. "Mr. Sereph is waiting for you, Mr. Griggs." Claudius had smiled at that. He doubted they were expecting the talent he was bringing. Mr. Sereph was at his desk when Claudius arrived. His smile was wide and bright enough to fall into. Claudius was honestly surprised that his head didn't simply separate in the middle and slide off. On his stark desk sat a fountain pen in a holder and an old-looking book. Claudius thought this was really what he was here to see. Not this grinning corpse or this fancy pen, but this silently breathing book that sat closed before him. "Mr. Griggs," Mr. Sereph said, his predatory eyes following him as he took a seat, "I am so glad that you decided to take us up on our generous offer. That was the moment that he realized he might be in over his head. He was a fox that had suddenly realized how big the bear was, and that he might not be as clever as he thought. For better or worse, he was in the trap now. He could only win or lose from here, and he was intent on not being another victim of this smiling man. "I assume you have looked over our terms?" Mr. Sereph asked, those eyes still intent on him. "Sounds a little too good to be true," Claudius had said, feigning disbelief. "Well, that's the benefit of working with a company like ours," Mr. Sereph said silkily. Claudius asked him what he wanted, what he meant by talent exactly, and Mr. Sereph assured him that it was all quite common. "We buy the talents of those who may or may not be utilizing them to their fullest. Your writing shows great promise, but it's clear that it isn't something you value. Sell us your talent, and we will compensate you for it. It's as simple as that." Claudius shrugged and asked how they would proceed. Mr. Sereph opened that hungry book and handed him the pen from the little holder. "What do I do?" Claudius asked, still not quite sure how this worked. "Just let your hands do their work," Mr. Sereph said. From the time the pen touched the paper, Claudius was writing. The ink was red, blood red, and Claudius filled the page with the darkness that swelled within him. Every grisly murder, every bloody scene, every pain-filled cry, every feeling of dread was perfectly conveyed with gruesome clarity. He wrote until his hand burned, until his fingers cramped, and as his shoulder went numb, he just kept his focus on that wide shark's grin his adversary wore. As the ink began to spill from the book in torrents, the sea of blood rising, Claudius felt his vision begin to blur. As his legs became wet with the effort of his hands, he let his look of exquisite rapture match that of Mr. Sereph's. When he awoke in his bed, a check on the nightstand, and a feeling of relief within him, he sighed in contentment. It was over for Claudius, but it was only beginning for Mr. Sereph. And now here he was, this ancient engine of destruction, looking for answers to a question that had only just arisen. He wanted to know why 3 writers who had, Claudius assumed, bought his talent, had murdered their families. He wanted to know why one of the most prolific crime writers of the age had decided to kill his wife, his kids, and his grandkids as they visited him for the weekend. Mr. Sereph was angry, he was embarrassed, and now he wanted answers. Claudius supposed he owed him that much. "Sit," Claudius said, smiling again as he saw the irony. Mr. Sereph sat, a vein throbbing in his temple. "You see, when you bought my talent, you believed all you were buying was my writing talent. My writing talent is okay, but my true talents lay in darker places than you could even have guessed. I write what I know, Mr. Sereph, and what I know is murder. Every one of my crimes is something I had written about in my short stories. Every cut, every gasp, every spray of blood was something I had created." As he spoke, Mr. Sereph's eyes grew wider and more concerned. "It was all great fun, but it couldn't go on forever. The older you get, Mr. Sereph, the harder it is to maintain that level of brutality. Despite knowing better, murder is often like a mania. You can't stop it. You can only appease it for a time. So, I gave it to you," Claudius said, grinning like a fool. Mr. Sereph was speechless. "Have you any idea what you've done?" Claudius sipped at his drink and fixed him with a decidedly toothy grin. "Beaten you at your own game, and gotten myself a reprieve from something that would have likely landed me in a prison cell. A real win-win for me." For just a moment, Claudius saw what lay beneath the surface. A flash, the barest glimpse, but it was enough to let him see the blistery old devil who lay beneath the flesh mask. Mr. Sereph had lost his cool for a fraction of a second, and Claudius realized he had won a victory over more than just a dusty old warlock or a talented spook. He had beaten a creature who had been young when his grandsire was first pulling itself out of the primordial ooze. "Well played, Mr. Griggs," Mr. Sereph said, rising to leave. "I'm sure this won't be our last encounter." As he left, Claudius drank his beer in triumph. He certainly hoped it wouldn't be. Dylan drummed his fingers on the desk as he stared at the blank screen. The Darrow Feuds by Dylan Mandry. He'd been looking at that title for 3 months, and it was starting to grind against his sanity. He needed this book to come together, but he just didn't have the words. The sequel to Darrow Farm had been highly anticipated after the first one had spent 6 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It had been a somber tale of pioneers looking for a fresh start, and the strange and frightening neighbors they had found in the woods around Utah's Hellman Valley. People had loved his description of the farmer's daughters, especially Gloria, who had ultimately been tempted by the strange creatures who resided within the forest and decided to leave the safety of her Protestant father and his homestead. They had wanted to know what happened next for the pioneer family, and Dylan's agent had been absolutely feral for his notes on the next part of the series. Dylan had been pretty interested in the notes too, wherever they were. The fact of the matter was, Dylan had begun to come to terms with the idea that he might not have another book in him. It hadn't been so bad at first. The book was successful, selling something like 6,000 copies in the first week. He'd been happy, his publisher had been happy, and his agent had been all smiles when he congratulated him on making the list. This was amazing for a first-time author, but when the book sold another 6,000 copies the week after that, Dylan was taken by surprise. Suddenly his book was being read by book clubs, discussed in literary blogs, and his agent called to tell him that the primetime show Caldermain Tonight wanted to offer him a guest spot on this Friday's show. It's a small segment, no more than 10 minutes, but it's huge for a first-time writer, his agent had assured him. After the interview, he'd gone on to sell something like 50,000 copies, and that's when the networks had taken notice. 4 months ago, he'd signed a contract with Amazon for the first season of Darrow Farm, and cashed a check larger than anything he'd ever seen. Suddenly, he could do no wrong. Suddenly, he was the industry's golden boy, and everybody wanted a word with him. He made the circuit with the show's director, and book sales continued to soar. He was on Caldermain again, plugging the show, when the notion of a sequel had first been pitched, and it had been an utter ruination for him. "So, with the success of your first book, how long before we see a sequel?" Dylan had been unable to answer, gaping like a fish before he tried to formulate something witty that wouldn't sound too unsure. I'm working on the first draft as we speak," he said, flashing the serpent's grin that seemed to be the providence of all successful writers. Who was it who'd said that all writers were liars? Probably many people, most of them as big, if not bigger liars than he was. Here he had sat, after making such a pompous claim with nothing to show for it, but a title, and a working title at that. He was no closer to finishing this book than he was to finishing the first chapter, and as Dylan sighed and put his head in his hands, he came to terms with the hard truth. He would never finish this book, and when the curtain fell on Season 1 of Darrow Farm, there would never be a Season 2. Now, said a voice from the chair in front of him. Dylan sat up quickly as he looked at the odd man who was suddenly in his study. "That's a bit bleak for someone your age." Dylan took in the odd man, his mind stuck in that strange limbo between fear and anger. How had this guy come to be in his study, a room that existed behind 2 locked doors? The locks had seemed a little needless until this point. Dylan lived in a fairly upscale neighborhood, in a 3-bedroom loft that he would probably have to move out of if he didn't get something written. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard sirens on his street, let alone heard about a break-in. The man didn't appear in need of any of his stuff, however. He looked like a carnival barker in his long black coat, the white shirt beneath looking crisp enough to cut. One polished boot was perched on a knee. His blonde hair looked odd as it hung over his mirrored sunglasses. He was holding a copy of Darrow Field, which he snapped shut as Dylan looked at him. The book was a prop, much like his attire, and Dylan suddenly felt the worm of curiosity poking to the surface. Who the hell are you?" Dylan asked, the words sounding way more confident than he felt. "How rude of me. I'm Richard T. Sereph, and I'm a blessing to men like you," said the man, flashing an obscene amount of pearly white teeth as he smiled. Men like me?" Dylan asked. "I assume you mean writers." "I was speaking of desperate men, but I often find that the two go hand in hand." Dylan sighed. "I don't know how you got in here, but I want you out of my study before I call the police. I'm hard at work, and you—" "Oh, I can tell," the man said, tossing the book onto the glass top of Dylan's coffee table. "You've been hard at work for the last 3 months now. Procrastination is a full-time job, isn't it, Mr. Mandre? Just who the hell do you think you... If you were a man of lesser means, I'd offer to pay you for your talent and take my leave. But you have something that many don't, and it makes the world go round." Dylan stood up, confident now that he understood where this was going. This huckster was after his money, and Dylan was in no mood to indulge him. "Get the hell out of my house. At this point, I don't think I need to call the cops. You keep moving on this course, I'll toss you out myself." The man smiled his predatory smile and reached into his coat. Dylan's compass suddenly swung around to fear again, and he took a step back as he tensed for the shot. The man would shoot him now. Dylan could already see the gun coming out, and he wondered what the news would make of his death. Famous writer killed before his time, they would say. And when the thud hit his desk, he could already feel the burning in his chest. Instead, he opened his eyes to find a small leather-bound book sitting on the edge of the desk. "For those with so much imagination, your kind always need proof." The book wasn't large, no great demonic tome or heavy arcane bit of binding. It was about the size of an average paperback, about 200 pages, but the leather covering it looked ancient. It was cracked, the symbols on the cover broken by jagged rifts, and the spine bore neither name nor legend. As it sat there, Dylan felt like something on the cover was watching him, something that did not love him. What is it?" Dylan asked, the man already crossing to the door. "A book," he said, as though it were obvious. "A very special book. It will give you what you need, and when you have it, don't hesitate to call me for more." He took a normal-looking business card from his front pocket and laid it on the edge of the table beside the door. He left then, but when Dylan got up to follow him out, he found his hallway empty. He searched the house, but it was occupied by only one slightly ruffled writer and one strange little black book. Dylan checked the door, returning to his work when he was certain that no one was lurking in his home. He sat in front of the computer, but his heart just wasn't in it. His eyes kept straying to that little book, and with every glance, his curiosity grew. It was nothing, just an old book, but his mind refused to believe it. It was a mystery, something new, a Pandora's box just waiting to be opened. He typed a few sentences, but immediately deleted them. He'd been doing that for months, the words sounding lame as they sat like slugs on the page. He floundered in this way for most of the afternoon, the book judging him as he played at work. More than once he started to reach for it, but always thought better. More than once he started to simply push it off the desk, but he felt sure that it would open its pages and there would be teeth waiting to bite him. In the end, he wasted another short time, and as the sun set and the day died, Dylan finally took the book in hand. He couldn't stand it anymore, and when he opened it up, he was suddenly sorry he had given in. The book made a hollow sound as it landed on the ground, but Dylan was suddenly rendered blind. An ice pick had lodged itself between his eyes, and the sudden, blinding revelation made him glad that he'd been sitting. He had experienced insight before, but this was akin to the most intimate defilement. If he could find the strength to lift his hands, Dylan imagined that he would feel his brain pattering to the carpet where a bullet had ripped through his skull. He was falling into some bright abyss from which there was no escape. And then, suddenly, it was all gone. He was sitting in his chair, his hands empty, but his mind was full. He wrote the rest of that day and well into the next, and when he emailed his agent the first 10 chapters of what he'd written, his agent's response was one of bemused confusion. "This is not a sequel to Darrow Farms," he said, when he called him 3 hours later. "Is that a problem?" Dylan asked, already guessing the answer. "If the chapters are as good as these, I doubt it will be," he said, and Dylan could hear the smile in his voice. He was sitting at his laptop again, waiting to be inspired. Roland's War had been the story of a cavalry deserter who defended a town he was settling in from a group of his old army brothers turned outlaw. It was well received, outselling Darrow Farms and earning a movie this time instead of a TV show. Kurt Russell had been cast as Roland, the main character, and the check he had been cut this time was even bigger than the one before. The royalties from Darrow Farms' TV show had also been substantial, and that's why he found himself here again. Amazon wanted a season 2, his publisher wanted a sequel, and Dylan, yet again, found himself trying to create straw from gold. He had written a few sentences that he liked, and a few paragraphs that he felt confident about, but he knew he would delete most of it later. The book was DOA, and he knew the likelihood of it coming out at all was slim to nil. He might as well try to write a sequel to Roland's War for all the good that would do him. As he wrote and erased, he thought again about the man in the black coat. He had looked at the business card more than once since that day a year ago, and he opened his desk drawer as he took it out and looked at it again. Richard T. Sereph and Libris Talent were printed on the front, along with a phone number. He could call him again, Dylan knew, but he had resisted up until now. He had no proof that Roland's War had anything to do with the book that Sereph had left behind. But, he thought as he hit the delete key on the better part of an hour's worth of work, he didn't have any proof that it hadn't. The phone rang only once before Dylan heard that smooth, oily voice waft through his ears. "Why, Mr. Mandry, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Dylan gulped. The man knew his number, a number he had never given him. I need more," he half whispered, and he could hear the muscles in the old demon's face as they creaked into a grin. "The price is 100,000, sent to my account that I am about to message you." A text popped up with the information to a private bank account. And when do I... But Sereph cut him off. "When the money is transferred, you will receive your book." But how long?" Dylan asked, his fingers dancing over the keys as he finished the operation. He had hit send on the money when the sound of his doorbell came from downstairs. There was a box on the doorstep, and inside was another leather-bound book. Mr. Sereph had already hung up. After 8 years, Dylan was still looking at an empty screen with the words Darrow's Feud on them. In those 8 years, he had written 5 more books, and made 5 more payments to Mr. Sereph. In 5 years, he had written 2 more cowboy dramas, a sci-fi novel that had shocked and impressed his agent and his peers, and a slice-of-life drama they had turned into a successful TV series, as well as a fantasy novel that even George R. was raving about. They had bred 3 more movies as well, and book sales in the hundreds of thousands. The name Dylan Mandry was synonymous with innovation and flexibility, and he had offers from just as many colleges as he did conventions. None of the big Ivy League ones, of course, but Dartmouth had offered him a very comfortable position if he was interested in relocating. They wanted him to teach his technique to aspiring writers, which was why Dylan had to turn them down. It would be difficult to teach a class on get rich and outsource your ideas to a magic man with books that scramble your brains 101. His agent and his publisher had long ago stopped asking for a sequel to Darrow Farm. They had decided that he was a one-book man, and they had both made enough money off of him to be satisfied with his writing process. They were happy to take his work, and a portion of his royalties, and these days the checks were sizable enough, though Dylan knew that soon they wouldn't be enough. Mr. Sereth's prices were akin to the pushers he had seen in his neighborhood when he was a kid. The first taste was always free, then they had you as a customer for life. Sereth's prices seemed to double with every call. 100 grand became 200 grand, became 400 grand, became 800 grand, became $1 million. I rounded it down, since you're a frequent customer, he said, and Dylan had paid it, even though it hurt to part with it. Despite being successful, he wasn't as rich as everyone thought. Giving Sereph several $1 million had hurt, and if the next payment followed suit, he would nearly be broke. The richest beggar in literature. No wonder most of them just drank it all away. He tried to resist the urge to call this time, watching the cursor blink as he tried to make the words come. Had it all been a fluke? Had he really thought that he had another book in him? Had he been so foolish as to think that he could write something that good a second time? No, he thought. The magic was still in there. It was him that was broken. He had gotten so used to taking the easy way out that he'd forgotten how the craft worked. Mr. Sereph was just another pusher, and Dylan was his loyal junkie who just kept coming back for another hit. He stared at the blinking cursor for another 10 minutes, feeling his time ticking away, before finally calling Mr. Sereph. Well, 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 if it isn't the writer of the decade. I've heard your name bandied about with great expectation lately. Yeah, thanks for all that, but I need help with this next book. You know the price, Mr. Sereph said. $2 million in my account. Then you... I need help with a specific story this time. Sereph was quiet for so long that Dylan thought the line was dead. Hello? Hello, are you there? I need you... I'm sorry, Mr. Mandry, but that's not how it works. Dylan was speechless for a moment. How what works? I can limit you to a specific genre if you like. Most of your fame seems to be frontier dramas, but I can't help you with a particular story. It just doesn't work like that. Dylan wanted to get angry. He wanted to rant and rail at this man who had taken so much money from him, but the curiosity that had brought him to writing in the first place made him ask the question that was rolling around inside his head. How does it work? That same muscle-tightening sound, like old ropes on a mast, could be heard as Mr. Sereph flashed his crest-kid smile from the other side of the phone. Do you care? Dylan did, but he said no. Some things were better left unsaid. Mr. Mandry, how do you write across multiple genres like that? Where do you find the inspiration? Dylan hoped they couldn't see him hide his guilty smile as he buried it. Well, I find that inspiration is fickle. Sometimes it gives you a bounty, but not always what you need. I've been hoping to recapture that inspiration soon, but so far, it eludes me. Class was almost over, and he always let the students pick his brain at the end. Dartmouth had been glad to have him, and the move to New Hampshire had been easy. Dylan had been able to pack up all his possessions in a suitcase, the ones he hadn't sold. He had kept 2 suits, some day wear, his laptop, and a few books. He had come to a new city with little more than the clothes on his back. If the 5 years before had been tumultuous, then the 5 that had come after had been turbulent. He still had no sequel to Darrow Farm, but he had published 2 more bestsellers. Both had been 2 years apart, and both had been the sort of oat operas that he had started with. The first was the best of them, Flanders Holdfast, and when Amazon had asked if they could adapt it for the series, He had told them to go right ahead. They had asked if he would mind helping them with the second season when all was said and done, and he had also agreed to that. Whatever magic had produced Darrow Farm had dried up, and he had come to terms with the fact that he was dry too. The second had been only 2 years before, and that was when he'd come to terms with the fact that he'd had a problem. Margaret's sachet had sold decently, but it had come nowhere near the cost of it. That had been when Dylan had sold all his things and moved to New Hampshire. The loft he lived in, the first eds he'd collected in college, the Dickens third eds he'd had from his father, his clothes, his signature, his blood, his sperm, whatever it took to get that next hit of success. He had long ago given up on the idea that one of these hits would be the sequel he wanted, but that hardly mattered. He wanted the high of seeing his name in print, the euphoria of being in the mouths of every important person in his circle, the dizzying feeling as he looked down from his ivory tower at all the little people who wish they could be him. That's why he was working here. He needed the money. He needed it bad. And if he intended to feel that jolt again before he died, he would pay for another hit of that Sweetest Nectar. He realized he'd been staring out the window and pointed to a young man in the front row. He thought his name might be Max, or maybe Philip, but after the numbers on the roster passed 10, Dylan had trouble remembering everyone unless they made an impression. He regretted calling on him when he stood up, that hateful artifact clutched in his hand like a crucifix. He wondered if Dracula had looked at the cross the way that he now looked at copies of Darrow Farm, and as the boy's teeth fixed into a flattered grin, Dylan tried to make his own do likewise. "I just wanted to tell you what this book meant to me when I was a kid. I loved all your books, and I'm not even a sci-fi reader usually, but this one really spoke to me. I know you must hear it all the time, but do you think you'll ever do a sequel to Darrow Farm?" Dylan thought about how to answer the question tactfully, and finally decided on the truth. No, probably not. I've been trying for years, and I just can't make it work. They dispersed then, seeming to understand that this was a good time to make themselves scarce. He reminded them to work on their chapters for peer-proofing tomorrow, and sat heavily in his chair as he thought again about Darrow's feud. It had been 11 years. If he hadn't done it now, he supposed he never would. "Mr. Mandry?" Dylan looked up to see the same kid who'd asked the question, remembering suddenly that his name was Malcolm. Sorry to bother you, sir, but I was wondering if..." He floundered a little, setting the copy of Darrow Farm on Dylan's desk. He wanted an autograph. They always did. The kid had turned to dig in his bag, looking for a pen, Dylan had no doubt. Dylan tried not to sigh as he reached into his desk and took out his own pen, signing the dust jacket as he slid it back to him. He tried to smile, but it was so hard with the proof of his failure sitting right in his face. "There you go, kid. I usually charge $25 for one of those, but your tuition keeps me warm, so this one's on the house." Malcolm smiled, but when his hand came out of the bag, he was holding a sheaf of papers. "Thanks, sir, but I'd like to know if you'd look at something I've been writing." His hands were shaking a little, and Dylan looked at the clock before taking the offered pages. Malcolm's class was his last of the day, and he had a few minutes to look over the kid's notes. He wasn't in a hurry to return to his dreary little condo, only having an evening of looking at the blinking cursor ahead of him, or the equally bleak numbers in his bank account that never seemed to rise high enough. He had laid the notes out, scanning them in a perfunctory way, but the farther he got, the more interested he became. "I hope it's not too forward, but I loved your book so much. I know it's rough, but it could be something if I had your help. It's not the actual sequel to Darrow Farm, but perhaps the spiritual successor?" Dylan devoured the pages as he read, his anger beginning to kindle. Who the hell did this kid think he was? This was plagiarism. This was theft. He'd see this boy thrown out of college, out of New Hampshire, but the most galling part was that it was good.
He could have overlooked it if it had been trash, but Malcolm had written something great. To hell with Darrow Farms. This was something better than it could ever be. He only had a few chapters, but they continued the Pioneer family story flawlessly. The more he read, the less angry he became, and the more his curiosity took over. Do you like it, sir? Malcolm asked, and Dylan's face must have looked ghastly because he'd taken a step away from the desk. I know it's pretty rough, but I think with your help, this is astonishing, Dylan breathed, looking up at Malcolm as if he couldn't believe the boy was real. You wrote this? Malcolm's smile was back in force. I did. I wrote it because you inspired me, sir. Do you really like it? Dylan almost didn't trust himself to talk. He loved it. He wanted to help Malcolm make it great. He wanted to introduce him to his agent and tell him that there would finally be a sequel to Darrow Farm, maybe even 2. He wanted to smash this boy's head in and take his notes and leave him for dead. He wanted to rip his skull open and eat his brain like some cannibal trying to get at his thoughts. The last image gave him an idea, however, and his smile was genuine when he looked back at the smiling young man whose future was likely to be much brighter than his. Or might have been. How would you like to have dinner with me, Malcolm? We'll talk about your book, and then you can come back to my apartment and compare notes. I love what you have here, and I'm excited to get started right away. Malcolm looked as though Christmas had come early. I'd love to, sir. Wow, you have no idea what a dream come true this is. Likewise, Dylan said, and as he rose, the two walked and chatted as Dylan made plans just below the surface. What have you done? Sereph asked as he stood in Dylan's dingy apartment and looked at the comatose form of his student. Dylan didn't think it took much imagination to see what he'd done. He'd fed the kid, they'd talked about his book, and while he was in the bathroom, Dylan had slipped something extra into his drink. It hadn't been anything too insidious, some sleeping pills his doctor had prescribed him a few years ago. But when Malcolm had started stumbling on the way to the apartment, he had wondered if the dosage had been too high. He had called Mr. Sereph after putting the sleeping kid on the couch, telling him that he had his payment, but he'd need to come and get it this time. I don't accept cash or checks. You know that. Transfer the money to my account, and you'll want to come get this payment, Mr. Sereph. Trust me. Sereph had seemed eager to see what Dylan had for him, but now he looked mad enough to chew up nails and spit iron. As Dylan's grandfather had often said, "Is this your idea of a joke?" said Mr. Sereph, and suddenly he was in Dylan's face, the eyes behind those mirrored shades the color of piss. "No, far from it," said Dylan, standing his ground. You told me once that with my talent, you would have just paid me for it and been done with me. But I had money, so I could afford what others couldn't. Get to the point, Mr. Sereph spat, his face still very close to Dylan's, close enough to make him afraid that he would bite him. I take that to mean that you take these stories from other writers. I want his story. You can keep whatever else he has up there, but I want Darrow feud. Take the rest. Take him. Take whatever you need, but I need that story. It was Mr. Seraph's turn to look taken aback, but his smile had returned. Wake him up before whatever you gave him wears off, he said, and he took a familiar-looking book from his coat. It might help if he's a little groggy when he makes this deal. Caldermain smiled as the lights came up, and Dylan was once again bathed in their glow. He was back, riding the euphoria of his high, and he never wanted to come down. He had finally done it. He had conquered his white whale, and as the crowd stopped clapping and the house band quieted, Caldermain turned to fix his regard on him. I never thought I'd say this, but it's a pleasure to have you on the show again, Mr. Mandry, with your sequel to Darrow Farm. The crowd clapped again, and Dylan gave them a peek at the first cover. It had been the greatest 6 months of his life. He had received Malcolm's story in the usual way, but Mr. Sereph had refused any sort of payment. The book, oozing whatever it was that made up the person's talent, went into his coat, and out came a smaller one, which he handed to Dylan. The boy's talent was substantial. This will help other writers and more than make up for your foolishness. I had never considered doing business like this, but you humans are always so inventive when it comes to the old sins. Please let me know if you stumble across any other tasty morsels in your class. The writing world truly is a tank of sharks, and their hunger is wide and deep. Malcolm had dropped out of his class the following week, and Dylan saw later that he had left the university altogether. He hoped the boy found something to take up his empty hours, but didn't really think about what he had done past that. All writers were liars, after all, and lying to themselves was no exception. So, it's been a decade or so since we sat in this very spot and brought up Darrow Farm. What led you to write a sequel after so long away from the source material? Well, Calder, inspiration is a fickle business. Sometimes it truly finds you when you least expect it.
He had set his table up an hour before sunset. His suit was immaculate for someone who lived out of his car, and Lucifer knew it was the key to his operation. A lot of these people who hawked did so in clothes that made them look like bums. Lucifer, however, was a born salesman, and he knew that if he couldn't buy you, then you wouldn't buy from him. Lucifer Marvelous Jones had the unfortunate luck to be the child of Cassie Koppel, a lifetime resident of Forest View Asylum. When the 42-year-old woman had come up pregnant, the questions of patronage had immediately arisen. Cassie said, and stuck with her story for the rest of her life, that Lucifer himself had visited her and begot her with his offspring. She held the death within her that was warned about in Revelations, and she would bring it into this world no matter what they thought. The staff was pretty sure that it had been Charles Danver, an orderly who had recently been fired for inappropriate relations with residents. But when Lucifer had been born, his skin was the color of coal, and it led to more questions than answers. The state took him away not long after they wrestled him from his mother, and thus Lucifer Marvelous Jones entered the system, a system that was kinder to him than most. Lucifer, despite his name and his humble beginnings, was possessed of an infectious smile and an unshakable positivity that others liked. He was adopted at 4 and lived with a middle-class family until his grades and impressive IQ were made note of by a local philanthropist who adopted him again and gave him a peerless education. Lucifer's grades ensured him a place at any college he wanted, and his backers' financial stability ensured that wherever he went, it would be the best. He had a degree in business before 25. The world prepared for him to open his own Fortune 500 company any day now. He surprised them further by taking up politics and philosophy, and his benefactor hoped that maybe he'd go into politics himself. He learned all he could about the human condition, studied psychology and human nature, and then surprised them all one final time by disappearing without a trace. He took some clothes and a bag, his best suit and shoes, left in his car one day with no intention of returning. That had been nearly a decade ago, but Lucifer had never stopped learning. He had simply changed classrooms. "Hey there, friend," he called to a man in a suit almost as nice as his. "Come have a chat for a minute. I got something I'd like to show you." The man would have been a hard mark for anyone else, but not for Lucifer. He was a businessman, a middle management type who clearly had dreams of rising, and normally he would have no more stopped to talk to someone on the sidewalk Then he would have taken out his wallet and left it on the lamppost. He was on his phone, but Lucifer had no doubt that he had heard him. He never let doubt enter his mind, and when the man turned, he hooked him with his winning smile and lured him in. The man looked surprised to be standing before the suited man's card table, but the hawker wasn't. He was right where he wanted him, and that was good. "Your case," Lucifer said, the man looking down at his battered Samsonite briefcase. "It's unbecoming of a man in your position." The businessman looked confused. "What's wrong with it?" "Oh, nothing. For someone who doesn't want to rise higher than middle management, that is. But you," he said the last words like he meant to roll in it, "you have big dreams. You can't hold papers for dreams as big as yours in a case like that." Lucifer reached beneath the table and produced something he'd been holding just for this man. It was a gorgeous leather attaché case with golden buckles and a polished brass handle, the kind of case the boss carried so that everyone knew who he was. The man's eyes lit up when he saw it, but Lucifer pulled it back out of reach. "Not before we've talked price, my friend." The man looked at him for a moment like he meant to fight him, but he wouldn't be the first to try. It wouldn't do him any better than it had done the others either. "The price," Lucifer said, his voice dropping a little, "is something small. Give me what you have in your wallet for starters. I know it isn't much, but the second part is the big ask." The man nodded, shakily fishing his wallet out before handing Lucifer the $300 inside. Lucifer produced a gym bag then, placing it on the table gingerly. "Take this bag to 2369 Hammerlock Plaza. Leave it in the lobby and leave without being seen. If you're seen, I'll know and come to get the case back. Do this, and the case will be yours." The man looked enraptured as he took the bag and case, nodding furiously before heading up the sidewalk with a new spring in his step. "That was deftly done," said someone from behind him. "You have a definite talent, my friend." Lucifer didn't jump, didn't tense, but it was the first time in a while that someone had snuck up on him. He turned his head a little as he saw the man in the coal-black suit, his hands on the end of a cane and his rump on the bench where Lucifer had taken the case from. "I should hope so, sir. I've been perfecting my art for years," Lucifer said. "Longer than you might suspect, I think," the man said, but Lucifer didn't let it affect him. He turned back to the crowd, angry that he had almost missed the woman as she came walking past. He'd been planning this for weeks, and he wasn't about to miss his chance. "'Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his smile attached when she turned with a nearly rehearsed swivel. "I believe I have something that you might be looking for." She walked over dreamily, and when he pulled out the porcelain figure from beneath the table, she shuddered in surprise. How did you know?" she said, reaching for it with a shaky hand. He covered it, though, with his big dark one, smiling disarmingly as he set the hook. "I have an eye for precious things, and people who share a love of fine things. All I ask," he said as he produced a letter, "is that you drop this into a mailbox for me. Somewhere near your work should do it, and you can take your prize with you." She snatched the letter, nodding as she took the figurine and walked briskly away. "Did you need something, friend?" Lucifer asked, without looking at the man. "I don't believe I've seen a face as distinct as yours before." The man had a smile that belonged in a funhouse, but Lucifer couldn't deny that he was charming and had a certain magnetism to him. "Oh, it isn't what you can do for me," the man said. "It's more what I can do for you. A man of your talent could—" "Hold that thought," Lucifer said.
whistling to a high school girl as she came walking past. Her eyes traveled from her phone for the first time in hours, and she came over to the hawker willingly enough. When he pulled out the bag, the look told him that she would have done all manner of degrading things to have it. Lucifer, however, needed no such act. "Take this letter to the owner of the deli on 3rd and Foreman. Tell him 7 o'clock, and don't be late. Bring the number 3 to the house we discussed. Do this, or this bag will be back in my possession by nightfall. Understand?" She nodded, thanking him again and again before walking away in a hurry. "Now then," Lucifer said, "you were saying." "As I was saying, your talents are of interest to us. We would like to purchase them for our company so that they can be utilized by our clients." "How interesting," Lucifer commented. "Does that line often work on people?" The man looked taken aback by his statement. "Excuse me?" "Oh, no disrespect, but I suspect that you're used to doing business with desperate individuals who value money a bit too much. The wording of your statement leads them to believe you're offering them work or perhaps a trade. They don't realize their mistake until the deal is struck, then must lament at leisure what they have lost. Am I close?" The man wanted to be angry, Lucifer could tell, but there was a level of curiosity to the old devil that intrigued him as much as it intrigued him. "But not you?" he asked, switching his grin for something a little more sardonic. "You're too great a salesman to be huckstered by my obvious naivete." Lucifer laughed. "You are many things, sir, but I don't believe that naive is one of them. No, you're someone whose empire makes mine look like a sandcastle to a king. I admit, I doubt I am as skilled a liar as you are, nor do I have as much experience rooking the sheep as Richard T. Sereph, but I'm no layman, and I can smell a predator when it enters my territory." The man's eyes gave away his surprise at being named, but his smile was no less merry. "Very well met, Lucifer Marvelous Jones. It seems that you have me at a disadvantage, something that doesn't often happen in my line of work." Lucifer steepled his fingers, letting the crowd pass behind him as the real battle of wills happened right here on his busy street corner. This was the single greatest deal of the man's life, and he knew it had the potential to go bad with only a single misstep. Lucifer had made worse deals, however, and was always willing to bet on his abilities. Besides, he'd come prepared for this meeting. "So, let me offer you a counter deal. I will not sell you my talent. It's far too valuable to sell, and I suspect that you don't want to buy it for just anyone either. I suspect that you want to monopolize my talent and use it to further your own endeavors. Am I correct in assuming as much?" Mr. Sereph nodded, looking genuinely impressed with the young man's assessment of him. "Impressive, but I should have suspected nothing less from the shadow broker of East Los Angeles. And yet, you thought that I'd sell my talent like someone looking for a fix," he said, putting his old tone back on with a laugh, showing that he wasn't insulted, but only disappointed. Mr. Sereph shrugged. "I had to try. I haven't come up against one of your kind who is such a match for me in a long time, and are unlikely to for quite some time," Lucifer admonished. "I am, after all, the Antichrist, if you believe my mother." Mr. Sereph's laugh was rich and terrible, and many of the people walking by shuddered, though they knew not why. I can assure you, Mr. Jones, you are not. That one has not yet been born, and hopefully will not be for many generations yet. "In that case," said Mr. Jones, "I propose a trade." Mr. Sereph raised an eyebrow at him. "A trade, you say?" "Never fear, sir. It's a trade that's mutually beneficial for both of us." "I'm all ears," said Mr. Sereph, smiling as he folded his hands in his lap. Here it was, his one chance. Lucifer hoped he was up to the challenge. "I propose that you hire me, and we further each other's objectives." Whatever Mr. Sereph had been expecting, his face showed Lucifer that a job proposition wasn't it. "A job! A job! You want to work for me!" It was Lucifer's turn to smile. "Don't act so surprised. Libris talent is a very lucrative venture, but it's a venture that requires talent. You are one person," he hedged, not wanting to insult him, but not wanting to undersell him either. "And you've been the sole representative of Inquisitions for quite some time. Why not let me help? I do have a knack for talking people into things, as well as convincing them that I can provide them with what they want." Mr. Sereph looked shocked, gobsmacked even, and when he leaned forward, Lucifer thought it might be the first time he'd been taken off guard in a long time. "Well, goodness, I haven't had to do anything like an interview in so long. I don't guess you have a resume I can look over, do you?" Lucifer thought about it for a moment. "I may, actually. Do you recall my transactions this morning?" Mr. Sereph nodded, ticking off items on his finger. "You sold a gaudy briefcase, a tacky figurine, and an overpriced purse." Lucifer smiled, but it was hard to keep the derision off his face. "Correct, though inaccurate and a little insulting. I sold a Lavar Manuel attaché case to a businessman who's hoping to impress his boss. In exchange, he gave me $300 and, more importantly, will drop off a duffel bag in the lobby of a building that holds a certain law firm. The woman traded a rare Hummel figurine for the promise that she will drop a letter in a mailbox for me. The letter contains evidence that the owner of Pax & Sons law office has been cheating on his wife with a mistress. Lastly, I traded a Lou Bodwin signature handbag for the promise of a message being delivered to Gino's Italiano. The message will ensure that food is delivered to the law office of Bob Steffens at exactly 7 p.m. That will mean that his door is open when the man I've instructed to go and break his knees goes to fulfill his contract." "Very devilish," Mr. Sereph said, "but what does that have to do with anything?" "The duffel bag contains drugs that will be traced back to the law office in the building. The wife of Jim Pax will ensure that a rift forms between him and his sons, who are his partners. Bob Steffen will have his knees broken and will be unable to recover fully. All of this will ensure that Joseph Treadwell, of Treadwell, Gabe, and Droff, is one of the few practicing attorneys in the area when a certain high-profile case comes up next week. It will also place him in my debt and leave no way to trace any of this back to me." Mr. Sereph looked impressed, but not sold. It was time for the closer. "All this is very impressive, but still doesn't show me why I should hire you." "Of course not," Lucifer said. "You won't understand that until I sell you something you want." Mr. Sereph laughed for true then, and it sounded like fingernails on wind chimes. "Me? You think you have something that will turn my head? I admire your courage, Lucifer Jones, but I don't believe you have anything that will interest me." "We'll see," Lucifer said, leaning down so he could reach beneath the bench where Mr. Sereph sat. From beneath him, he took a box, a simple wooden box, but as he set it in his lap, he knew the old demon could sense something within it. It was something special, the first and only gift his mother had ever given him, except his life.
He'd kept it since it had been mailed to him by someone at the adoption agency when he had turned 18. It was his most prized possession, and he knew it was just what he needed. Did you know that the doctor handed my mother something on the day I was born? Something very special. Oh? Mr. Sereph asked, trying for disinterest, but finding it hard to maintain. Yes, it was the only thing she had to remember me by for 17 years before her death. They said that a week before she died, she mailed it to my caseworker, telling me that it was my birthright and my inheritance. It's my most prized possession, and if you agree to hire me, I'll give it to you. Mr. Sereph swallowed loudly, his eyes boring into the box as he waited for it to be unveiled. Lucifer opened the box, and inside was a wonder. It was a black feather, the end forged into an ink pen, and it was the most beautiful thing that Lucifer had ever seen. He had sat in bed the night after receiving it and ran the feather over his chin, feeling its texture and hearing the words of the letter in a voice that he had never heard in life. "It's your birthright, your inheritance," the letter had said, and he had known it was very special. Mr. Sereph looked at the feather, delighted and not bothering to hide it. He was like a child who receives exactly what he wants for Christmas, and now cannot believe that he's seen it made real. It was clear that he wanted to reach for it, but he seemed unable to just yet. Where did you get this?" he asked breathlessly. "My mother claimed I was holding it when she delivered me, and she claimed it was proof of my true patronage." When Mr. Sereph tried to reach for it, his long-fingered hands trembling, Lucifer closed the box with a snap. "What do you say?" Lucifer asked, offering him a hand. Mr. Sereph thought about it, clearly not used to being on this end of the deal, before shaking it with a smile and a deep belly laugh. "Welcome to Libra's talent, Lucifer Marvelous Jones. I believe you will fit in very well here."